I'm so sorry we missed each other when you last came to town. I heard from Inde you sat with her telling stories.
Boa tarde a todos. Sejam bem-vindos ao Festival IN e a uma conferência onde vamos falar de Lisboa, vamos falar de criativas, vamos falar da economia criativa da cidade de Lisboa. Eu tenho aqui uma cábula para me ajudar. Eu vou fazer o enquadramento do que é que vai acontecer esta tarde nesta conferência de economia criativa da cidade de Lisboa, mas gostava de dedicar as primeiras palavras a alguns agradecimentos e palavras de reconhecimento pelo trabalho que foi feito até podermos ter chegado aqui e fazermos o que vamos fazer hoje. A primeira palavra que eu gostava de dar é para a organização do Festival IN, para a IP. Eu acho que estão todos de parabéns. Tem sido um festival extraordinário. Eu acho que é um ato de coragem fazer um festival. Ainda é um aquecimento, isto ainda é um warm-up para aquilo que vai acontecer em novembro, mas eu acho que se o festival que vai acontecer em novembro tiver qualquer coisa e for ainda melhor, de preferência, em relação ao que aconteceu nestes 2 dias aqui, eu acho que vai ser um festival muito interessante e vai ser um festival interessante e importante para a cidade de Lisboa, para Portugal, mas também para fazer com que Lisboa possa aparecer nestas áreas, que são várias, no mapa do mundo. Eu acho que, portanto, o primeiro agradecimento é para a IP. O segundo agradecimento muito especial é para o Charles Landry. Thank you very much for the acceptation of this invitation. I will make my presentation in Portuguese. I believe it will be no problem because what I will present here, Charles already know. We have talked a little bit about it. Charles has some to do with what we are trying to do here in Lisbon, not only with the Lisbon City Council. So thank you very much for your presence. And as you all know, Charles will be the keynote speaker, so I will be just an appetizer to open your appetite. A terceira palavra vai para a presença, nós temos 2 vereadoras da Câmara Municipal de Lisboa nesta sala. Graça Fonseca é a senhora vereadora da Economia e da Inovação. Catarina Vaz Pinto é a vereadora da Cultura. Não sei se há mais algum vereador da Câmara Municipal de Lisboa na sala, mas presumo que não. E eu acho que isto é talvez o ponto mais importante. O que nós estamos aqui a falar, e o que foi falado nestes 2 dias, tem muito a ver com a necessidade de falar e de trabalhar com muitas pessoas diferentes, cruzar muitos setores diferentes, cruzar muitas competências diferentes, e por isso é fundamental tentar trabalhar como nós esperemos que consigamos trabalhar no futuro quando lançarmos estes desafios que vamos lançar hoje aqui. Uma palavra também especial para o António Câmara. O António Câmara tem aqui um papel um bocadinho ingrato, que é fazer um pequeno comentário, mas é um comentário inicial à intervenção do Charles Landry. Mas o papel do António Câmara aqui é um papel muito importante, porque é ele que vai um bocadinho servir de gatilho, de trigger, para a conversação que vai acontecer depois da intervenção do Charles Landry entre o Charles, a Graça Fonseca e ele próprio, António Câmara. E essa conversação, este pequeno primeiro momento de interação, vai permitir depois que a gente possa também conversar um bocadinho com vocês e possam também fazer questões e fazer perguntas a qualquer uma das 3 pessoas que aqui estão, aqui no palco. E por último, não é por último porque ainda tenho mais agradecimentos, mas há um agradecimento que é muito particular e vai para um conjunto de pessoas e de instituições que estão aqui nesta sala. Eu não os estou a reconhecer a todos, mas para todos os atores individuais, coletivos, que fazem parte daquilo a que nós chamamos a indústrias criativas, as indústrias culturais e criativas, a economia criativa da cidade de Lisboa. Eu sei que estão aqui muitas pessoas, estão aqui muitas organizações. Um agradecimento especial aos que aqui estão, aos que não puderam estar e que gostavam e que nos disseram que gostavam de estar, e àqueles que não estando cá, sabemos e temos a certeza que vão estar connosco neste caminho que a cidade de Lisboa e todos os seus parceiros vão trilhar no futuro. Portanto, um agradecimento muito particular, porque aquilo que nós vamos querer fazer só se faz com todas as pessoas e com todos os atores. Ninguém aqui está a mandar em ninguém e ninguém está mandatado para fazer nada por outro. Eu acho que isso é uma questão fundamental. Uma palavra para a ETIC e para os 2 alunos. Eu peço desculpa, eu não tenho aqui o nome deles. Peço imensa desculpa, mas os blueprints, os booklets que vocês têm foram desenhados por 2 alunos da ETIC e, por isso, um agradecimento especial para eles e pelo trabalho que tiveram, a paciência que tiveram connosco de desenvolvimento de desenvolvimento do documento que vocês puderam ter acesso. É um documento que foi trabalhado por um conjunto de entidades, por um conjunto de parceiros. É um princípio de qualquer coisa, não é um fim em si mesmo. E aqui nós também um agradecimento especial para 2 investigadores do Bigote, a Isabela André e o Mário Val, que tiveram também a oportunidade de fazer um trabalho sobre o que é que são as criativas na região de Lisboa e que serviram de input, Catarina Celada da Intelli, o Luís Serpa. Há um conjunto de pessoas com quem nós tivemos a oportunidade de ir falando um bocadinho para discutir algumas das questões que são apresentadas neste blueprint. Dito isto, eu começaria a minha intervenção por explicar o que é que eu estou aqui a fazer. Eu vou apresentar, eu sou Paulo Soares de Carvalho, Diretor Municipal de Economia e Inovação da Câmara Municipal de Lisboa, e vou-vos apresentar aquilo que nós chamamos como sendo o blueprint da Economia Criativa de Lisboa. É uma espécie de um pequeno bilhete de identidade, é um documento, digamos que provisório, é um work in progress e é um ponto de partida, não é um ponto de chegada. A primeira mensagem e a primeira imagem que eu tenho para vos mostrar é esta imagem que aqui está. Ela traduz uma coisa muito simples. Quando nós falamos em criativas, quando falamos em indústrias criativas, quando falamos em cidades criativas, nós não estamos sozinhos. Estamos muito e bem acompanhados por todas as cidades que querem ser alguém na área da economia criativa, na área das indústrias criativas em todo o mundo. E, portanto, a primeira coisa a dizer é nós não estamos sozinhos, mas nós não podemos hesitar. E temos, sendo a cidade que é, e o potencial que tem, e os ativos que tem, nós temos que entrar no palco mundial, no palco global. E a cidade de Lisboa tem que se posicionar, tem que aparecer, tem que se expor e tem que fazer com que todos os seus atores e todos os seus ativos, pessoas e instituições que cá trabalham todos os dias em áreas a que nós chamamos criativas, possam ter uma palavra a dizer na economia global, na economia criativa global. Se quisermos, hoje em dia, nós todos sabemos que a competição global acontece, se calhar não tanto entre países ou em grandes regiões, acontece entre cidades. E é nas cidades que estão os atores que fazem com que possamos ser mais ou menos competitivos, possamos ter mais ou menos vantagens competitivas e possamos criar mais ou menos emprego. E a mensagem que nós temos é que a cidade de Lisboa tem que posicionar-se e tem que competir e tem que cooperar nesta economia global, neste arquipélago de cidades criativas a uma escala internacional. O blueprint é um documento muito simples e que está organizado desta forma. Ele começa por uma delimitação. Nós não tivemos muito trabalho, escolhemos uma delimitação. Há muitas limitações sobre o que é que são as indústrias criativas, o que é que são economias criativas, o que é esta área nebulosa que trata da cultura, da criatividade, onde as coisas se sobrepõem umas com as outras, onde as fronteiras não são assim tão claras e tão definidas, mas onde é possível criar imenso potencial de emprego, de atividade económica e onde muitas das pessoas que trabalham nestas áreas amam aquilo que fazem e a vida delas é aquilo. Eu acho que uma das mensagens que o Charles vem trazer é que é um setor que às vezes as pessoas têm muita dificuldade em perceber o que é, incluindo a banca. Têm dificuldade em perceber que pessoas são estas, que amam e que a vida delas é aquilo e que não é a empresa ou outra coisa qualquer. E, portanto, a primeira coisa é onde é que estão as fronteiras? Onde é que está a fronteira e onde é que está a delimitação interna? E utilizámos uma delimitação simples. Nem vou discuti-la. Podia ser outra. Depois utilizámos 2 caminhos de trabalho que nós achamos que é fundamental para pensar ou para tomar qualquer decisão. A primeira coisa é quanto é que vale? E temos um primeiro esboço de quantificação. É um primeiro esboço, aliás, desatualizado já temos mais números. E o outro caminho foi quem somos na cidade de Lisboa? Quem é que são estes atores? Qual é que é o mapeamento? E fizemos aí um trabalho mais profundo, que não está acabado, mas que é um trabalho mais profundo, de mapeamento de todos os atores das indústrias, dos segmentos ditos culturais e criativos da cidade de Lisboa. E tentámos posicioná-los e tentámos perceber onde é que estão concentrados, onde é que estão a nascer coisas novas, onde é que elas se ligam umas com as outras. E este, se calhar, é o primeiro input para a reflexão e para a discussão que certamente nós gostaríamos muito que tivéssemos todos em conjunto na cidade de Lisboa, entre todos. O segundo momento, que é o mais importante de todos, e é aquele que ainda não está feito, está só embrionariamente trabalhado, é este blueprint não é um documento de research, não é um documento de investigação, é um bocadinho mais de intelligence. O que nós queremos é quem é que nós somos enquanto cidade criativa, o que é que nós podemos fazer, o que é que nós valemos, que oportunidades é que temos à nossa frente, para onde é que nós podemos ir e para onde é que nós podemos ir em conjunto. E por isso é que nós desafiamos todos aqueles que têm alguma coisa a dar à cidade de Lisboa na área das criativas, independentemente do que é que isso possa significar em rigor, e desafiamos aquilo que é um convite à ação. E esse convite à ação não está pré-determinado, não está fechado, mas nós achamos que há 5 ou 6 grandes áreas onde Nós, Câmara Municipal, já estamos a trabalhar com imensos parceiros e há projetos que estão a surgir para quem esteja atento e quem gosta particularmente destas áreas. Eu acho que consegue perceber que a cidade de Lisboa está a mexer. Se calhar pode mexer mais, mas nós estamos a fazer os possíveis enquanto município para trabalhar com vocês em qualquer coisa que seja importante e que fique para o futuro. E nós achamos que há um conjunto de áreas onde nós podemos agregar projetos, atores, parceiros, iniciativas que podem mudar a cidade de Lisboa. E eu só vos estou aqui para dizer 2 ou 3 notas sobre cada um deles. No Blueprint terão uma oportunidade de o ler com mais pormenor e mais profundidade. Bom, eu se calhar até passava por aqui, porque a discussão sobre o que é e o que é que não é uma discussão profunda, é uma questão difícil. Não é fácil dizer o que é e o que é que não é, mas a nossa preocupação do município neste momento não é tanto trabalhar em investigação sobre o que é a economia criativa, o que é indústrias criativas. A nossa questão é trabalhar em conjunto com os atores para fazer coisas, para transformar a cidade. E por isso estamos a trabalhar em conjunto com um conjunto de parceiros. Alguns pertencem ao universo da Câmara Municipal de Lisboa, e estou a ver aqui algumas pessoas, o Francisco Mota Veiga, do Departamento de Cultura, da Direção Municipal de Cultura, o Miguel Honrado, da EGEAC, não sei se estará cá também a Bárbara Coutinho. Quer dizer, eu não vou dizer muitos para que as pessoas não fiquem sensibilizadas ou sentidas comigo por não falar nelas, mas há o universo da Câmara, dos parceiros, das entidades que estão mais próximas, que estão a começar a trabalhar com todos aqueles que estão mais longe, mas que esses sim fazem a diferença na cidade de Lisboa. Nós trabalhamos digamos que esta organização, porque para nós é muito importante depois termos os números e, portanto, é muito importante saber quanto é que valemos, onde é que estão as estatísticas. E as estatísticas têm que ter uma correspondência com uma classificação que, obviamente, tem que ter depois uma organização para fins estatísticos. Portanto, muito provavelmente o Charles Landry, melhor do que ninguém, se calhar, pode falar um bocadinho sobre o que é isto da criatividade, o que é isto dos segmentos criativos, o que é isto da economia criativa. Uma nota, nós ontem e hoje organizamos uma Policy Clinic no âmbito de um projeto comunitário que se chama Cross Innovation. Esse projeto é muito interessante porquê? Porque não é sobre isto, não é sobre os segmentos criativos. É sobre o que é que a criatividade pode fazer por segmentos que, à partida, nós achamos que nada tem a ver com a criatividade. Os têxteis, e nós temos a trabalhar um bocadinho sobre isso, a Graça depois poderá no final falar, os têxteis, as áreas das cortiças, tudo isso tem muito a ver com a criatividade, mas é uma criatividade que está no topo da cadeia de valor. E nós estivemos a discutir hoje como é que essa criatividade pode ser útil para setores que, à partida, nós achamos que nada tem a ver com a criatividade. Portanto, estas classificações valem o que valem. O que podem valer é como gatilho, como trigger para a gente começar a fazer qualquer coisa que pode mudar a vida de muita gente. Porquê as cidades? Bom, as cidades são, não só hoje em dia a competição acontece entre cidades, mas as cidades, não é a cidade de Lisboa em particular, a cidade de Lisboa é uma cidade especial. Não é só porque eu nasci em Lisboa, eu acho que é uma cidade especial. Eu ia dizer, eu conto sempre a mesma anedota, porque o Mourinho, quando chegou a Londres, disse que ele era the special one. E eu digo sempre para os estrangeiros que Lisboa é a special one. É uma cidade especial. E é uma cidade que tem um potencial extraordinário. Mas todas as cidades têm um potencial extraordinário para fazer várias coisas. E as razões... A primeira reflexo é que todas as cidades estão a fazer, melhor ou pior, este movimento de trabalhar na área da economia, da atração de investimento, de empresas, de talentos, na área do empreendedorismo, na área da inovação e na área da criatividade. O que nós estamos a fazer em Lisboa não é qualquer coisa que mais ninguém esteja a fazer. Não. Toda a gente vai por ali. Porque não há outro caminho. Podem fazer melhor ou pior. A segunda questão é que nas cidades é possível fazer 2 coisas que é mais difícil fazer quando estamos a falar, por exemplo, em países. Nós conseguimos pensar estrategicamente, o longo prazo, conseguimos pensar em abstrato e depois conseguimos executar. Porque estamos à distância de metros do parceiro que vai implementar aquilo no terreno. E isso é uma coisa extraordinária. Eu nunca tinha trabalhado numa cidade e uma das coisas mais reconfortantes que nos dá um maior sentimento de que estamos a fazer qualquer coisa pode mudar é quando vemos as coisas a acontecer. Quando pensamos nelas e depois quando as coisas acontecem e outros começam e fazem o caminho de as implementar no terreno. Isso é muito mais difícil de fazer à medida que estamos mais longe do espaço, do território. A outra questão importante é que as cidades são qualquer coisa que não é mecânico, ou seja, é feita de pessoas, é feita de coisas, é uma coisa orgânica e é uma coisa que está sempre a mudar. E nós temos que sempre acompanhar a mudança, porque essa mudança, quanto mais próximos estamos uns dos outros, como sabemos, mais fricção existe, e o Charles vai falar um bocadinho sobre isso, certamente. Quanto mais próximos e quanto mais fricção existe, mais criatividade existe. Mais nos confrontamos com a diferença e mais somos capazes de fazer coisas novas, fazer coisas diferentes. Não é por acaso que tudo aquilo que são os espaços de coworking, os espaços de incubação, é juntar pessoas num determinado espaço e aproximá-las, e muitas vezes essa aproximação e a junção de um designer com um arquiteto, com um engenheiro, ou com um economista, ou com um sociólogo, faz com que aconteçam coisas que, se calhar, sozinhos nunca seriam capazes de fazer. Outra questão que é muito importante, e se calhar aqui a cidade de Lisboa teve, acho eu, algum pioneirismo, que é, as cidades hoje em dia são um laboratório. São um laboratório para fazermos coisas, para experimentarmos coisas, para desenvolvermos coisas, para testarmos coisas. E essas coisas podem ser conceitos, ideias, experiências, mas também podem ser produtos e serviços. Portanto, a cidade é o laboratório. The city is the lab. É qualquer coisa que acontece hoje em dia em todas as cidades. E às vezes coisas que nós achamos que nada tem a ver com isto, como o orçamento participativo que começou há 6 anos, e onde a cidade de Lisboa foi pioneira, é o princípio de qualquer coisa que hoje em dia nós estamos a utilizar para fazer outras coisas. A Startup Lisboa, a incubadora que existe na Rua da Prata, nasce do orçamento participativo. Quer dizer, a partir de nenhum de vocês que não esteja por dentro ou esteja próximo, pensaria que uma coisa tem a ver com outra. E o orçamento participativo são ideias que nascem das pessoas. Portanto, as cidades são um espaço, um território particularmente importante para fazer este tipo de coisas. Bom, porque Lisboa? Aqui vou ser claramente biased, vou ser claramente tendencioso, propositadamente. A primeira coisa é, a cidade de Lisboa é o ponto mais luminoso da Península Ibérica. Como vocês podem ver por esta fotografia de satélite. A questão é quando nós começamos a mover o satélite. É verdade, podemos não ser tão luminosos como parece à primeira vista. Mas, dito isso, nós de facto temos um potencial criativo extraordinário. Não estou a inventar nada e não estou a socorrer-nos os números. Nós somos uma cidade com uma capacidade e um potencial criativo extraordinário. Não só criativo, mas também de conhecimento. E, portanto, nós estamos muito bem posicionados para sermos qualquer coisa e para nos orgulharmos de o ser no mundo. Mas é no mundo, não é em Portugal. No mundo. Eu acho que isso é importante. Nós devemos colaborar internamente em Portugal e competir e sermos diferentes no mundo. É a nossa posição. A segunda é, isto não é um cérebro, parece, mas não é. É um trabalho extraordinário feito por uma estagiária que nós tivemos durante 6 meses na direção municipal, Catarina Saldanha, e que fez este boneco, que é uma junção de 4 mapas da cidade de Lisboa. Se vocês olharem com atenção, isto são 4 mapas da cidade de Lisboa. Isto diz um bocadinho o potencial de talentos e de conhecimento que existe na cidade de Lisboa. Números que, se calhar, muitos de vocês não sabiam, ou não sabem, ou não têm presentes, e que são fundamentais para nós, para tomarmos decisões. Primeiro, nós temos mais de 100 instituições de ensino superior, instituições, faculdades. Temos cerca de 140 mil licenciados ano, 140 mil estudantes, 30 mil licenciados, e os números continuam por aqui. Estes são números extraordinariamente importantes. Porque valem qualquer coisa na economia internacional. Porque é possível fazer coisas com estas pessoas. Nós temos cerca de 2 mil licenciados ano nas áreas criativas, independentemente da organização que possamos ter. São números fundamentais. A cidade de Lisboa é ela cada vez mais um espaço para a criatividade. Ela, organicamente e materialmente. Nós conhecemos alguns dos artistas que trabalham a própria cidade. E depois, um número que eu também não tinha noção e que é um número extraordinário e que tem a ver com um dos T's do Richard Florida, que é o T da tolerância. Nós temos na cidade de Lisboa 50 nacionalidades. E pessoas de 50 nacionalidades e pessoas de 50 naturalidades. Isto não sei se é comum. O Charles conhece o mundo inteiro e anda pelo mundo inteiro a pesquisar e a trabalhar as cidades criativas, mas é uma coisa extraordinária. É um sinal de tolerância e de que é possível trabalhar a diferença numa cidade e num território. Esta imagem que está aqui é uma imagem tirada do Polo Norte, é uma imagem, não, um desenho, e que faz com que tem a ver com outro T, que é o da tecnologia. O António Câmara vai falar um bocadinho mais da tecnologia. Eu só diria que Lisboa está no mapa dos cabos de fibra óptica submarinos, e isso é uma vantagem comparativa que se pode transformar numa vantagem competitiva. Números da economia criativa da cidade de Lisboa. Estes números estão subavaliados. Lisboa é a cidade mais criativa de Portugal, de longe, mas por um conjunto de circunstâncias. Umas são históricas, outras são culturais, outras têm a ver com o facto de ser uma cidade capital, mas é. E, portanto, estes números que são muito abaixo daquilo que é a realidade, por razões estatísticas, dão-nos um bocadinho a ideia do que é que isto é e do que é que pode ser no futuro. E do que é que estas pessoas podem fazer para setores que, à partida, nós achamos que não são muito criativos, quisermos assim. Estes números estão todos trabalhados no blueprint e, portanto, poderão vê-los com mais atenção, mas são números interessantes e números impressivos, que impressionam pela quantidade de gente, de valor e de emprego que envolvem. Ao nível do mapeamento, o que nós fizemos foi fazer, não um recenseamento de todos os atores que existem nas criativas, mas tentar perceber quais é que são um conjunto que nós achamos muito extenso e que está inacabado, mas que nos permite ter algumas imagens da cidade de Lisboa, que se calhar muitos de vocês imaginariam que seria assim, mas que assim, desta maneira, ela é muito clara. Por trás disto, há realidades específicas, há projetos em concreto, Muito provavelmente qualquer um de vocês que trabalha nas áreas criativas consegue reconhecer que está algures ali, ou então não está e devia estar. Também pode acontecer. Mas, como é óbvio, a cidade de Lisboa e a criatividade, os segmentos criativos da cidade de Lisboa, estão concentrados em determinadas zonas. A zona central da cidade, e nós todos percebemos o que está a acontecer na Baixa, o que está a acontecer no Bairro Alto, o que está a acontecer na zona de Santos, o que está a acontecer no Caixo de Dré, a extensão para Alcântara, para o X Factory, o que acontece no Braço de Prata. Ou seja, há zonas da cidade de Lisboa que são incrivelmente criativas porque há uma grande densidade de criativos. Isto, basicamente, é a densidade dos atores criativos na cidade de Lisboa. Nós tínhamos preparado aqui um pequeno vídeo feito pelo Pedro, que está aqui mais um estagiário que trabalhou connosco, que esperemos que volte a trabalhar connosco, e que fez um pequeno vídeo sobre uma visão panorâmica das densidades e da concentração dos diferentes segmentos das criativas na cidade de Lisboa. Nós vamos tornar isto público, como é óbvio, portanto poderão ter a oportunidade de ver isto com mais atenção. Se calhar não é surpreendente, mas para a tomada de decisão política é fundamental. E isto dá-nos uma ideia do que é que... De onde é que estão as criativas? Nós sabemos que o X Factor está por aqui, mas se calhar conseguimos entrar por dentro destas imagens, desta visão panorâmica e aérea da criativas na cidade de Lisboa, e a partir dali tornar... Isto pode ser um bom cartão de visita para qualquer pessoa que não conheça a cidade de Lisboa, etc. Eu vou tentar acelerar um bocadinho, até porque vocês vão ter a oportunidade de ver estas questões mais em pormenor no próprio blueprint, e depois temos a possibilidade de ter os atores em si nos diferentes segmentos na cidade de Lisboa. Aqui estão os serviços criativos, as indústrias mais culturais, tudo definido, tudo mapeado, tudo georreferenciado para podermos trabalhar e para podermos ter uma consciência do que é que somos para podermos atuar no futuro. Isto é a junção de tudo. É um mapeamento que nós fizemos. Mas nós não fomos só os atores. Ou seja, os atores são instituições, coletividades, entidades que trabalham nestas áreas. Podem ser maiores, mais pequenos, podem ser mais industriais, mais culturais, podem ser mais elitistas, digamos que mais populares. Mas há uma outra coisa que acontece na cidade de Lisboa durante o ano inteiro, que são eventos culturais e criativos que, olhando em conjunto, nos permitem ter uma percepção e uma consciência de que é uma cidade onde há sempre qualquer coisa particularmente importante e particularmente visível para fora, onde nós podemos... neste momento acabou de chegar mais uma senhora vereadora da Câmara Municipal de Lisboa, portanto já são 3. E nós podemos perceber isto um bocadinho com uma atenção redobrada. Se olharem para aqui, e podemos fazer um pequeno zoom, são eventos muito diferentes, de natureza muito diferente, eventos que juntam milhares de pessoas, outros juntam dezenas de pessoas, ou centenas de pessoas. São eventos que implicam um investimento de muitos milhões de euros, implicam o emprego de muitas pessoas, o esforço de muitas pessoas, e nós achamos que isto pode ser alvo e são âncoras da competitividade da cidade de Lisboa. Se nós olharmos com atenção para isto, em conjunto, nós podemos fazer, se calhar, um bocadinho mais, todos juntos, do que, se calhar, fazemos, cada um tratando de cada um dos eventos ou de conjuntos de eventos em separado. Até porque estes eventos têm ligações uns com os outros. Eles estão ligados, às vezes. E se não estão ligados, alguns poderiam muito bem estar ligados e criar sinergias uns com os outros. E, finalmente, o blueprint não é um documento, não nos dá... Quer dizer, deu-nos um particular gozo fazer o blueprint, mas a nossa vida não é fazer documentos, textos. A nossa função é fazer coisas. Criar emprego, desenvolver economia, é a nossa função. E, portanto, o que nós queremos é que essa função seja feita por todos aqueles que têm alguma coisa a ver com as criativas da cidade de Lisboa. E por isso é que a nossa função é ter uma visão panorâmica, porque a Câmara Municipal de Lisboa e qualquer cidade é a única que tem esta visão. Não há mais ninguém que pense o bem da cidade e que o pense como um todo. Não há mais ninguém que substitua a Câmara Municipal de Lisboa, qualquer uma delas, nesta função e nesta posição privilegiada para pensar o todo. E temos uma outra coisa que é única, que é sermos capazes, se formos capazes de fazer, e se tivermos essa vontade, de juntar e de federar e de mobilizar pessoas em projetos. Alguns nós podemos ter um papel, outros não devemos ter mesmo qualquer papel e devemos fazer com que as coisas possam acontecer. Portanto, o convite à ação passa por pensar a longo prazo, mas também começar já. Ou seja, trabalhar a diferentes horizontes temporais. Segunda questão para nós é muito importante, é não fazer qualquer coisa como se fosse um interruptor, ligar e desligar. Não, nós achamos que é muito importante que isto seja o princípio de algo sistemático, orgânico, onde as oportunidades possam, digamos, ser integradas e o caminho que se possa fazer um bocadinho fazendo, e não mecânico, não é suposto ser linear, é suposto ser orgânico. Achamos que é muito importante que seja co-criado com os atores e, de preferência, pelos atores. A ideia de que a cidade é o espaço para se fazerem coisas hoje em dia está a acontecer no mundo inteiro e achamos que é fundamental que aconteça na cidade de Lisboa cada vez mais. Bom, eu juntei isto tudo, juntámos num parágrafo, em 2 ou 3 parágrafos, que refletem um bocadinho as palavras-chave. Eu não vou repetir o que disse de forma separada neste conjunto de parágrafos. Gostava apenas de vos lançar o desafio que está implícito no convite que nós estamos a fazer através do Blueprint. O Blueprint acaba aqui, mas é suposto ser o princípio de qualquer coisa. Na plataforma, num movimento onde todos possamos em conjunto fazer com que a cidade de Lisboa seja, para já, perceptível para os outros o que ela já é, que é uma cidade incrivelmente criativa, uma cidade extremamente competitiva e um parceiro por excelência de qualquer outra cidade ou de qualquer ator no mundo que queira fazer coisas connosco. E, portanto, achamos que, quando falamos em clusters, quando falamos em setores de atividade, este setor de atividade, que nós chamamos as indústrias culturais e criativas, as indústrias criativas, a economia criativa, ela não deve ser, no futuro, um setor competitivo com potencial. Ele já é. E, portanto, a primeira coisa a fazer é tomarmos consciência de que já somos uma cidade com potencial incrível, mas que temos muito para fazer. E esse caminho faz na economia global. Portanto, a internacionalização. Segundo, estes eventos são âncoras de competitividade. São âncoras hoje de competitividade e são investimentos muito grandes que devem ser valorizados através de uma lógica de sinergia, de complementaridade. Terceira questão, e aqui há atores que estão aqui presentes e que estão a trabalhá-lo, a Central Station, o novo Hospital do Desterro, um mercado do Forno de Tijolo com um Fab Lab e com um espaço de coworking, o Welsh's Factory, que é hoje em dia já um paradigma daquilo que deve ser uma refuncionalização num território. Há um conjunto de coisas que estão a acontecer na cidade de Lisboa e que fazem com que seja cada vez mais, não só possível, como necessário, transformar espaços subutilizados e que têm um potencial extraordinário em espaços onde seja possível criar e dar emprego às pessoas e que elas possam trabalhar, de preferência em conjunto, umas com as outras. O empreendedorismo criativo é fundamental para nós. Uma das áreas estratégicas da economia da cidade de Lisboa, na área que estamos a desenvolver, é o empreendedorismo e nós achamos que há muito por fazer aqui. Nós temos neste momento 2 incubadoras Startup Lisboa e estamos a pensar que seria uma oportunidade única trabalharmos uma Startup Lisboa Creative, uma incubadora criativa. E temos todos os ingredientes para o conseguir fazer. Não a Câmara, mas os parceiros com quem estamos a trabalhar. E é um projeto que certamente verá a luz do dia, não daqui a muito tempo. E os talentos, ou seja, atrair, reter e criar talentos criativos na cidade de Lisboa é uma das grandes prioridades de qualquer cidade e tem que ser uma grande prioridade da cidade de Lisboa. E é por isso é que a esmagadora maioria das escolas de arte e de design da cidade de Lisboa, se não estão aqui é porque não puderam estar. Porque elas, eu acho que estão com a cidade e vão querer fazer coisas com a cidade. Portanto, tudo o que tem a ver com espaços e com equipamentos que eu já referi aqui, que se reproduzem um bocadinho nesta ideia que está aqui. Eu terminava, e até porque eu fiz questão de acelerar um bocadinho, porque o keynote speaker é o Charles Landry. E é com ele que todos temos que aprender. E o grande desafio, the major challenge that we will put to Charles is try to help us with your expertise, your experience, and try to make this, I won't call it a dream, because it's reality, but to move a little bit forward our ambition and our desire to make Lisbon a creative city. So I will stop and invite Charles to the stage and make your presentation. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. And that's the clicker? Yep, forward and so.
You must wait for them to...
Great, thanks. Anyway, thank you very much for being here. It's a pleasure. Lisbon is obviously one of the great cities of the world. You know that. It's a fantastic place. And just using the word culture, I'm talking first about the creative economy, culture, how that connects to the creative city. Of course, Lisbon as an artifact is a cultural artifact which communicates through every fiber of its being. So any creative economy strategy has to reflect that character, distinctiveness, personality that is essentially from here, Portugal, and so on. The danger with all these strategies is that they can be imitative. But anyway, you know all that. Paolo also mentioned that, you know, other cities are doing this. The interesting question that I hope we discuss is how do you make the most of being behind? Because in a way that can have advantages, and it would be interesting to talk with you about what those advantages might be. Now, what's in a name? It's quite important. When this all emerged, this debate in the early 80s, people talked about the cultural economy, and that had a certain sort of political frisson in it, that phrase, and it was quite sort of provocative, I think, in a rather positive sense. And the British government then in 1997 brought out a report where they used the word creative economy. I'm not sure that's really good because at one level it can make people feel who are not in this particular sector feel, well, I must be very boring because I'm not part of that sector. And of course, as we know, creativity is more widely spread. There is another term that used to be used, which I still think is quite good, which is really the industries of the imagination. But anyway, we're using the word that we have. I remember back then in talking about all of this in the early 80s in the UK and elsewhere, you know, people were sort of saying, oh, this all sounds very vague, it's all a bit unclear, it's opaque. Do you mean this is a serious stuff and so on? And the definitions were sort of fuzzy and kept on moving until people at some point sort of broadly agreed the characteristics. But I think what we can say is that these sectors, these industries, obviously have something to do with identity, the resonance of a place, the image, but also because of the whole move towards a more experientially driven economy, they have a central contribution to make, as you know. And of course, wherever you go, people talk about soft power, so this obviously connects to soft power as well. So those issues, I'm sure you're all very aware of. I mean, the whole notion of spectacularizing the city is at one level interesting, at another level perhaps too much. So it really all depends. This is Venice at the Biennale period, and that's certainly quite interesting, I have to say. I'm not suggesting you have Zeppelins floating around Lisbon. But another question which I think we should put right at the front, what's the aim? Is it about developing the creative economy, or is there a bigger aim, which I think there should be, which we can discuss a bit later, creativity in the economy as a whole? So I just leave that question floating there for a moment. Now, I want to just go through a bit of the trajectory from how this whole sector moved from the margins more to the center, if you forgive me. And I remember 1984, when we were doing the first studies on this issue, people really were saying, you know, what the hell are you talking about? You know, we were trying to knock on the door of various institutions and get inside. We were trying to get inside government, and that door was essentially closed. We could never get round the table. Basically, there was an element of, in a sense, of exclusion and misunderstanding. And what people didn't really understand then, but they understand, of course, more now, is as one moves towards a more knowledge-intensive economy, it is really many things that are intangible that are insignificant, and many of those things that are intangible, of course, developed often through the creative economy, that really add value. And the other problem was always that the financial sector never really understood how this operates, how this sector operates, and therefore it was very difficult, particularly for startups, to get going. So these issues still remain, as you well know. The financial sector still seems to think it's, again, rather unimportant, often lifestyle businesses, and so on. So what one could say, it was an uphill struggle. But clearly, at some point, I would say, around the beginning of 2004, around, things became different. And in the case of the UK, it was quite interesting. It was all spurred by the whole shift and restructuring in the economy that we all know about, the shift towards, ultimately, Asia and so on, and the way production processes changed dramatically, and thus the economy also too. And in particularly for the UK, there was a certain moment which was interesting, which was to do with cars and the motor industry, which of course, as you know, has completely declined in the UK. But the break point, the decisive breaking point, was when our government realized that the exports of cars was less than the exports of the music industry. At that moment, people paid attention. So that was one significant moment, which was to do with exports. And of course, I know there's an advantage of UK music in that sense. So you saw companies, this is Rolls-Royce, declining, whereas the music industry and other sectors, of course, grew in that process. The other very important issue, which really made a dramatic difference, was initially people had just looked at the fragments. They might have looked at performance, dance, music, design, video, film making, television, whatever, the elements. And of course looked at those fragments and thought, oh, well, they're very small and so on. But once one could point out the interconnections which there are, of course, between these sectors, as you well know, if you're producing a record, there are many of the creative industry sectors that are part of that, you suddenly see there's a connection. And when you see the connection, you also see the contribution being much larger than it initially was. And that varies depending on the city you were in. In London, it happens to be very large, in New York, of course, and so on. But in general, in capital cities, in general, it tends to be 6, 7, or 8%. So that suddenly then became significant. The other particular link, which again is very well known, was the link between those sectors, perhaps particularly the more artistic end of it, and urban regeneration. What do you do with all these old buildings that are hanging around? How can you fill them up again? And many of these buildings, like this one, I'm just showing one in Rotterdam called the Creative Factory, now have more people working in them than they did when they had a factory, but based on completely different sets of activities. And what's so amusing for me is these places, which are essentially horrible places inside, where horrible working conditions, are now, of course, the places for the hip. This is a typical co-working space. There's about 6 companies working in that particular image. But that, of course, is again quite well known, but it definitely, obviously, made a massive contribution to the revitalization of economies. The other thing was that a number of people were actually rather inventive. Again, I'm using a Dutch example from Tilburg. There's this textile museum there, and I thought, oh Christ, not another textile museum looking at old machinery. But the museum, run by someone who said, I have nothing to do with museums, I'm an anthropologist, created a center for the development and creation of new textiles, and there is a showroom in there as distinct from a museum shop. So anyway, that's another sort of overarching trend that was very common. At the same time, there was this welter of evidence being created. I once, about 4 years ago, tried to count how many pieces of evidence from cities about the sector were, and I lost count. I don't know what it was, 150. It doesn't really matter. But there is this mountain of evidence. Now, what's interesting is levels of evidence. It's quite interesting that the creative economy needs more levels of evidence to be taken seriously than if I talked about nanotechnology, where there's often nothing there at all. And that, again, I find quite significant, the way in which this sector can be sometimes completely undervalued. But of course, you know that when we're discussing, let's say, the creativity of places, the elements are, obviously, some people think the creative place, a creative milieu is one which is sort of artistic, just has artists. And of course, we want to fill the city with artists. And of course, the artist makes an incredibly interesting contribution. But it's not necessarily the totality of that sector. But of course, the art sector itself, I just did a study of Mayfair, London, where the turnover of just selling art is £700 million a year, which is sort of reasonably a large proportion of the economy. So even the traditional arts themselves are tradable products and services. But particularly art, and I'm using art just as one example, has become really a source of capital as well for other set of purposes. So there's a whole series of things that begin to fit together that nowadays, as distinct from then, begin to sort of pump up the desire and the desirability of this sector. And of course, you know it's a vast sector. I'm not going to go into details, but you know, this is a picture of a company in Shenzhen in China, which is an animation studio, and you know, there are 3,500 people working in it. So just to give you an idea, let's not compete with them, let's do something different, of course. But you get the drift. And of course, again, like we talked, the word clustering was mentioned earlier, of course these things tend to cluster, but it's quite interesting when you look at the different particular forms like music. This is the music cluster in Istanbul. They tend to like certain types of places which are sort of slightly fine-grained and intimate. But again, these places, I'm moving to another city, Amsterdam, this is MTV's European headquarters. Again, it's in one of these old structures where they've retrofitted the place. And again, I'm just building up the picture a bit. Even those traditional things like craft, this is now London Origins, which is a major craft event, has really fed on the whole idea of the reinvigoration of the movement of making, the making movement, which obviously Fab Labs is one manifestation of. But that in itself is only a beginning, and even in the States now people talk about the fact that they're manufacturing again in the States, partly because people, you know, all developments have their flip side, so virtuality, not being able to touch things, obviously generates the opposite as well. So part of this again, and in time led to the spectacularizing of the city, fashion, all of these things, and we can see that in Lisbon as anywhere else. But there are some interesting examples of using the techniques from within the creative economy, like this is the Emscher Park area in the Ruhr, the industrial area of the Ruhr, which has actually, I think, done very interesting things, in a sense, blending the past into the future, using this sector as part of the driver to help that. And if you look at the European Centre of the Creative Economy, you can read a lot about the developments in that region. And I suppose we have to then end up again with design, which is moved to some extent from the specific thing, and of course you know about that, from just designing objects and so on to design thinking, designing policies and so on. So all of these, the essences of this sector are sort of invading everything else. And here, just in passing again, this is the old Nokia factory. More people work here now than they did in the old factory. 800 people work in that, whereas before it was only 250. So again, interesting. And I think there are also some very interesting interventions, and quite often smaller cities are where you're using public assets in an interesting way. Arnhem has a very good fashion school, and what the city has done with some of its social housing is at the bottom to allow students coming out of it to have their shop and production on the street. That has led to further developments. For example, in this case, the music industry has moved in. So all I'm really talking about here again is clustering processes. But the key point about this development, and I think that's a good development, is that it is not only purely consumption driven. The danger, of course, with spectacularizing the city is it's all about shopping and so on. A further person needs to be mentioned here, which, as you know, Richard Florida wrote a book called The Rise of the Creative Class, which talks about some of these people, artistic people, designers, etc., and also people involved in, you know, software design and so on. He, again, typically has his office in an old building in Toronto. Now, the danger of this, and this type of development, is, again, it creates groups of people which excludes others. And for me, just coming from where I come from, I'm more interested, or equally interested, in the bigger, the holistic view of a place, a city, where ordinary people, the other 70% who are so uncreative, make the extraordinary happen if given a chance. Because when you look closely at a city, you can see that it's lots of versions of creativity, often connected to the creative economy, that make interesting developments occur. And of course, this economy has acted a bit like an R&D zone. An R&D zone for the evolving economy, because the way things like theatre work, when we look at detail, how it works, sharing, cooperation, and all of that, if we just look at the mechanics of, let's say, putting on a theatre play or a film and so on, it's very much the way that we now see some of the more mainstream economies. So that methods of working thing is quite important. The other point about it is really a very significant development, which again I think you'll be aware of, which is to do with crossover innovations. And just taking one example, serious gaming. The essence of gaming is various forms of knowledge, but the serious gaming aspect is its application. Its application, for example, in helping people with autism, its application in health fields and so on. So I want to begin to start getting us to think beyond the sector. Now clearly, one of the big issues that's emerged is there's this set of ideas that in most places there's a lot of it, and they need spaces. And space, if you think about it, has become one of the most significant things around. I'm not saying you create places called Chaos Room, but nevertheless, there are places called the Chaos Room. But generally, this happens to be the Philips factory in Eindhoven, which is a very interesting co-working space and very successful, is one of the obvious models, and I know you've got some as well. You've certainly got startup places. I just saw this morning. So, you know, you're not behind, you're there, the things are happening and so on. But let's look at something that I personally find interesting. Let's look behind what each sector means. I think sector thinking on its own is not quite enough. Of course, you have to start with the sector, say we're important, we exist, and all of that. But if you look behind music, there's sound. If you look behind plastic arts, there's visualization. If you look behind, obviously, film, there's image, there's movement, and so on. And what you find, and my first realization of this, is if you look behind these sectors, there's much more. I remember working in Perth, in Australia, and looked at the mining sector, and I found that actually in mining there were many more people from this supposed creative economy sector than actually, you know, shifting soil and so on. And if you think, for example, of how you discover oil on a seabed, it's to do with sound technology and so on. I know that might not be satisfactory for someone who wants to write a piece of music, but nevertheless, there's a lot there. So all of these things, in a sense, begin to reveal that we've got an area that is of utmost significance. And, I mean, this is just a thing in Taipei and Taiwan, which is, again, to do with visualization, which is to do with how we see communities in new ways. It might look mad here, but when you're actually immersed in that, it's quite an interesting experience. So therefore, if you consider sectors, many sectors, and I've looked at quite a few of them, certainly the first three, chemical processes, medical diagnostics, logistics, e-commerce, and so on, you can see that these skills within them are increasingly migrating to the skills associated with those people trained in the creative economy. Currently, many of the people in that are engineers, and we have nothing against engineers, but a few engineering minds linking with a few artistic minds can do no harm. So if you look closely at logistics, obviously you know there's a lot of stuff going on that's to do with the sector we're talking about. Now, I think, though, the creative economy has something even deeper than that. And I think this comes back to the point I mentioned earlier, which is about the identity, the story of a city, how you make meaning. And I think that shouldn't be forgotten, which is why I started by saying that this sector was initially called the cultural sector, culture broadly defined in the sense that I'm looking at it. So these other aspects of storytelling, driving, participatory processes, and so on, I think are equally significant. Some people would say, oh, that's all social stuff. But actually, when you're trying to regenerate a place, you precisely need some of that social development and so on. Now, in this whole general drive I'm trying to describe, there is obviously partly a danger, as it says here, a danger that things become museumized, and therefore adaptation is incredibly key. This is just an example from Roubaix near Lille, where there was a swimming pool. The guy said, I'm moving somewhere else. The guy said, I want a museum. So he put the museum in the swimming pool. Now, that actually is quite a good project because in the water they have fashion shows, not inside the water, although they may be doing swimming trunks, but generally they put wood there. But all I'm trying to say is, when you look at it in this way that I'm beginning to tell you, everything sort of becomes a resource for reinvention. But now I want to just focus a bit on the trendiness aspect of that, because we all know that these types of places, this is the Löwenbräu in Zurich, and that sort of rather dull-looking building in the back is the business school. And that Löwenbräu, of course, has been turned into an arts place with lots of things going on. It's the headquarters of Hauser & Wirth, which is the third biggest gallery in the world by turnover and so on. And it's also next to the area where things like eBay, you know, you can recognize the names, they're all very high-tech companies. And it's really reacting against the typical classic techno-park idea, which people feel has not got enough urbanity in the sense, the best of what a city offers, the capacity to meet, connect, and so on. So these developments are okay. You can see them here in Berlin, where you see this very flashy building next to the very famous squat called How Long Is Now, next to a Kunsthalle, which you know is a sort of artistic space. So all of these things are not without contention, because of course gentrification processes occur a lot. In addition, the idea, you know, the art, fashion, luxury nexus has added another dimension, as people have realized, you know, how do you make buying a pair of shoes, how can a shoe be more than a shoe? And this is all, of course, as we know, about branding and all of that, which is, again, tends to be globalized brands. How many Bulgaris do you want to see, etc., etc. But it's about, obviously, in a sense, shopping. And I come back again to this point about also production. I mean, you probably had this here as well. Louis Vuitton, in the autumn last year, had that good link, or interesting link with Yayoi Kusama, who I think is a fantastic Japanese artist. But again, here's a sort of dilemma. What is it? Is she the artist? What's she doing? Is she selling the clothes? They all sold out. They all had dots, etc., etc. It's not straightforward. The same is happening with Prada, Tiffany, and so on. And also, talking about shoes, Ferragamo in Florence has a museum. Ferragamo sold shoes to Marilyn Monroe, had a very interesting exhibition about Marilyn Monroe. Again, nothing really wrong with it, but I just think we should be aware of this interesting interconnection between art as art and art in some sense used for commercial purposes. But the other dimension of it is, of course, that these companies, like Gucci, another museum, the Gucci Museum, is trying to give itself, obviously, more status, credibility, and so on. Some of these things are playing themselves out. I'll just use a London example in Shoreditch. In Shoreditch, you know, in East London, where the London Design Festival takes place. That's what it's called. And it says here, the world's first pop-up mall will open here. Unique, what does it say? Unique mix of international fashion, arts, and lifestyle brands, galleries, and cafes. What more do you want? I don't know. But could make you happy. But anyway, you can again see what the environment's like. It's next to the old Truman's Brewery, and there's a very interesting graffiti around. I love this one. Please wait here until you are useful. Thank you. Yes. Anyway, you know, I'm just showing you that it's happening everywhere. Dumbo, you know, is apparently New York's creative capital. Paris has just built this thing, which is its major fashion center of excellence. And even Singapore hasn't done it. It had all these companies in containers, but because the price of land is so high, they took the containers away, and there's this sort of sad exhibition of all these companies that are so interesting, and all you see is their signs as they move into some really disgusting office block. But anyway, all of this is about, as we know, generating vitality. And of course, the sector is one of the main generators of vitality, of magnetism, of generating some sense that here is a place I want to be. And that, of course, is in some ways the bigger purpose. So every city in these competing cities you show are really trying to show themselves to be central to somewhere. And of course, I should have put there the South America and Brazil in a very, very big red spot. But that's what cities are trying to do. And there's nothing wrong with that, because one obviously wants to be a central place. Now, the question is, can Lisbon be part of the nexus of, let's say, the top 25 cities that in some sense control the world? I seem to have left out, oh no, I did put in London. Thought I missed out London. It's not that good in London. But anyway, the question is within this set of networks and transactions and communications nodal points, can Lisbon and can this strategy, and I think it can, contribute to some new sense of centrality, of some sense that this Lisbon is a compelling place? And that's very different from China here, Beijing, where, I don't want to be negative about Beijing, but it does have to say originality square. So we'll be unoriginal everywhere else, except here, where we'll be original. I mean, that's how I read that. I also saw this in Sao Paulo, which said Pavilion of Creativity, and I thought, at last I found creativity in Sao Paulo, or not, as the case may be. So anyway, creativity doesn't work in that classic way by just putting a label on things. I think another issue we must mention is really the question of icons. This is the latest global icon, Hamburg, Herzog de Meuron, who did the Beijing Stadium and Tate Modern. This is the Elbphilharmonie, 13 stories of apartments. Below is the concert hall. It went over budget 20 times. That often happens with mega projects because you compel people to get in and you say, it only costs 30 million euros. You're already committed. No, it's 60. Oh, no, it's 90. Oh, it's 200. Oh, 600, and so on. So the icon strategy is difficult from my perspective. I think there's always been a complete imbalance between investment in hard infrastructure, equipment, or whatever you call it, and content. And, oops, I nearly jumped over that because I discussed this with you earlier. Because I did see the CCCB building, and I thought, that's a bit depressing, seeing Carlsberg there. But that's my problem. But I just asked myself a question, and I take everything into account you said to me earlier. What would the impact have been had the same amount of investment been in people's skills and entrepreneurship and everything you've said? Wow, I think Lisbon would be on the map. And so whatever you do, and it would be on the map, because I think the main drive always has to be your own version of this distinctiveness. Because, you know, we're saying it's all so cool, but have you ever thought about the word Soho? We're moving to Soho. Soho coffee shop. Soho bar. There was a Chinese restaurant in Riga in Latvia I saw the other day, Soho. Then I went to Beijing, Soho Galaxy. So even these things, yes, Soho obviously means south of Houston Street in New York, and in London it has a location. It was always historically for 150 years a really creative area. But the whole process of branding, of course, then reduces the level of distinctiveness, and I'm just using the word Soho. So I hope there's no place in Lisbon called Soho. Promise me, none. Excellent. So whatever it is, it's got to be your version of Soho. Certainly not Soho Galaxy. I mean, these Chinese, they're really brave, aren't they? The Galaxy, not just Soho Bar, the Galaxy. Anyway, one of the key messages, and this may be, I don't know if the cultural person is here, what I mean by cultural person, the cultural vice mayor, is this question of, I don't know how culture and economy works. in Birmingham in 1986 or 85, they set up an overarching committee called the Arts, Economy and Culture Committee, which actually merged, not merged, but brought these two departments together in a joint conversation. So there has to be, and particularly in view of the austerity we're in, a more relaxed attitude about commercial, non-commercial, even though the logics, of course, are completely different. But I think one has to face those dilemmas. They just exist. And I've already mentioned that point about production and consumption, not more to say. But one thing I think is really interesting is what happens when the big money moves in. In this case, the Financial Times is supporting all sorts of activities. And those agendas, of course, may be your agenda, but they may not be. And having a level of confidence about this is really key. And we heard this morning a fantastic example from Berlin, where they've set up a new system where people who want to invest, versions of Financial Times, have to bid to invest in interesting projects. So there's been a level of confidence for the cultural, creative sector to say, hey guys, we're not going to just go like that. You have got to go through our assessment, our version of risk assessment, just as much as they're doing it to you. Now, I don't know if you can read this, but this is fantastic. This is Zurich. There's a new Renaissance hotel. The whole area has been transformed. There's only one building left of the last, and this is about gentrification. And an artist has put the word resistance in exactly the same typeface as the Renaissance hotel. So this picture encapsulates, for me, in some senses, the dilemmas that we're facing in these development processes. Now, I want to just broaden out for a moment, and I'm just going to look over here to see if I'm on time. I've spent 0 time. Good. That's good. So I just want to look closely at the what I'm calling the creative imperative. I want to broaden this out, this argument I've made that is derived from within the creative economy out to the city. So why is there this imperative? I, of course, think it's a matter of survival. It's a matter of survival, it's urgent. This graffiti in Tel Aviv, it's 1 minute before midnight. Whatever way you want to put it, I think it's really a key thing for a number of reasons. In part, it's due to with global positioning, which obviously this was perhaps more the center of the world. Perhaps we're going downhill, and obviously the rise of the East in one way. So that is just one, in a sense, not metaphor, but one point about that shift. And even in China, there's the shift, that old guy looking as if he's going downhill and the woman looking as if she's going forward. And even in these sectors we're talking about, there's intense competition. And the products that emerge from it, all the containers arrive here, never go back, which is why 3 million containers, which are empty, are floating around European ports. So the dramatic transformations that we're talking about, you all know about, you know, agricultural, da-di-da-di-da, and so on, industrial, to the knowledge economy. But what people have realized is, how do you get knowledge? How do you get an innovation? You only get knowledge and innovation if prior to that you have had some creativity in order to generate the knowledge and the innovation in the first place. And that's one of the big reasons, I believe, that realization, which is why people have created a greater focus on this area. So innovation may be to do with doing things just on time and in very perfect ways and absolutely fine advanced manufacturing and all of that. But again, coming back to the design thinking notion, I thought it was quite interesting the other day. I saw this in Toronto. It was the Toronto Stock Exchange, and all the signs had been taken off. Guess what it was being? It was changed into a design exchange. I mean, I know this is only, again, a metaphor, but it's a metaphor for what is more valuable, which form of capital is more valuable, just purely financial capital, or the capacity to create sensory objects, of which clearly the iPhone is one of the key objects. So a lot of this is, of course, about ideas, and these processes some people find very invigorating, Others find it completely the opposite, very frightening. You can see, if you look at the world of graffiti, the responses to these transitions, you know, the chaos thing has been going around for years, as well as the pain one. But I thought this one was particularly interesting. I saw in Liège, which said capitalism equal chaos. Right, that's fine. But the next one I thought was a bit more interesting. Anarchy equals order. Now, I'm not saying either are true, but what I'm saying is in relation to the response of a young person who's 18, it raises quite central issues, big issues indeed. And the main one to me in relation, which you know I don't need to tell you, is that whereas 15 years ago people went to the job, more educated people certainly, and then the city, the job was first, now people choose the city and then the job within the city. So what the city is like becomes absolutely key. And if we call this group of moving people talent, I don't particularly like the word talent because it assumes there's a group of talented people and a group of ignorant people over here, but I'll keep the word talent for the moment, is really about how you make this place such that they don't leave. And I know many have left, and I heard your Prime Minister, someone had said everybody go, I'm not sure, someone sent me an email, said I should say that. But anyway, thank God I remembered that. Anyway, the point being, although I'm talking about cities, I'm not pretending that this is some revelation, because cities have always been creative. This is Brunelleschi in Florence. Can you imagine the innovation required to actually put that together, you know, I don't know, 30 meters up in the sky? Incredible. Or the Sagrada Familia, you know, all of that's just another version of creativity at a certain moment in time. The difference is that we're now self-consciously saying that creativity itself is a resource, whereas it wasn't seen as a specific resource independent of all sorts of other resources like capital and labor. But in order to trigger this off, I believe even prior to creativity, it's necessary to create an environment of curiosity. And that, if we're dealing with the public sector as well, and indeed the private sector, requires organizational structures that are quite open, that allow the creative mind to flourish more, which is, of course, a mind that is more fluid and flexible, in my view, knows when to be closed and when to be open. So it's not all about just having new ideas. And so if you put this in a cycle, you'd probably say the priority is to generate curiosity, out of which there may be imagination, out of which creativity may evolve, out of which an invention may emerge, and when applied widely, it would become an innovation that leads to a further grouping of that cycle. And such a place, which I'm hoping Lisbon is or will become, finds imaginative solutions and opportunities to any issues or problems that emerge. And so what we're really talking about is actually a creative ecology. So part of this, and we've already seen it within the creative economy, is about things like rethinking, conceptual rethinking, creative bureaucracies, technological innovations, artistic ones, new business models and social innovations, and so on, which is essentially a culture of creativity. So rethinking. That, of course, is incredibly difficult since most systems, organizational systems, are so rigid. It means the rethinking saying, and we discussed this over lunch, Arthur, is the way a crisis could become an opportunity, because it forces people to sort of get outside of their accustomed box. And it means as well, in the context of the city, rethinking the rules and incentive systems to make things happen. Very interesting piece of Russian art, I just remind you. I'm sure there's a bit of rethinking needed too. So what those innovations might be, they come from various sources, but the key thing is that they somehow connect and mix. You know, you might rethink architecture. Here's an Italian city that is built into the rocks. It's called Matera, and they call this negative architecture because it isn't outside, it's all inside. But anyway, you know all about that. You know, things like open source innovation, new ways of collaborating with companies, and so on. So I don't expect you to read this. But basically, when you say that, it's quite broad, the scope I'm talking about. The applications are broad too. It could be techniques, processes, procedures, the way you implement something. Even the open data movement is a creative innovation at some sense. It's taking participation to a new level. The different mechanisms for networking in all sorts of ways, from Petra Kucha to whatever, are in a sense mini small innovations that help. The whole notion of the smart city is a useful innovation in a sense of using ICT to make livability in cities simpler and easier. The fact of using old factories to become universities, in a sense, is an innovation. And in that way, you could say that creativity is you could say it's a currency. And indeed, given everything I've said, really, the creative economy and all this other stuff I'm talking about is like electricity. You could not run an economy without it, because it adds value to every transaction and so on. So therefore, from a city perspective, we need to switch the question from what is the value of design, art, the creative economy, and all of these things, not what is the value, because that puts you on the back foot. It's a much more interesting question. What's the cost of not? So I'm incredibly keen on that other question. I never ask the first question, what's the value? I always ask, what's the cost? But if we're talking about this wider culture of creativity, culture, this cultural perspective that is focusing on distinctiveness and so on, is usually not our operating system. And this other invisible hand, not of the market, doesn't work strongly enough. So let's look at this just a tiny bit more closely. We know the world's in motion. We know it's a smaller place. We know that different cultures are coming together in different ways that might have diametrically opposed views of life and who we are. We might be having a global culture that on the one hand is interesting, on the other hand is incredibly homogeneous and boring. And we might say all of that, if we put everything together, could be called a paradigm shift in terms of how a city should work. And that does indeed put cities at a crossroads, because I think they have to rethink. We have to drag out the old thinking about cities. We have to remind ourselves that in the last period, 150 years, the way we thought of cities is basically in terms of hardware. The people who build the hardware are usually the people who have been in charge. And that leads to all sorts of places that are undesirable. That's not to say that engineering is bad. I call this whole process the urban engineering paradigm. Of course, things need to stand up. But there is something else missing, which is absolutely essential if the creative economy is to flourish. And as Albert Einstein reminds us, the thinking that got you to the problems you have, da-di-da-da, will not be the thinking that gets you to where you want to be. So if we say there was a city called 1.0, there might be another plan, Plan B, which is City 2.0. I'm only using that silly computer language because it just helps me give you this talk. But the difference between the first and the second is the second blends in hardware and software thinking and organizational rethinking simultaneously. It understands that the city is an emotional experience that is the key driver. It understands that how places work, how we generate space and place, that people want to connect and meet, requires a different sense of a sensuality, understanding how soulfulness works, how you generate atmospherics, and in a sense how you, well, I happen to like this picture, but what I mean is how you redesign. There's an old innovation, the Eiffel Tower, there's a new hydroponic building next to it. So that's the type of thing I'm talking about. And some of these new spaces are so much, this is Adelaide Airport, is so much like what you've already done. If I just took a bit of this, you could say, oh, that's a typical thing we did 200 years ago. And that's why I think there's so much potential when I, as an outsider, come to a place like Lisbon. But this rethinking of cities might be very trivial and simplistic, like here in Tirana, where the grey buildings were painted. And it's absolutely clear in this building, which is showing the direction to the airport, which direction the airport is. So you get the idea. So what we're trying to do, not we, the world, is trying to get that rich combination between the intimate, the village feel, and that opposite sense of that worldliness. And great cities tend to have that unique combination. And you can see this retrofitting conviviality everywhere. This is Chicago Millennium Park, just as one example. This is Cheonggyechong in Seoul, where they just took away the motorway, recovered the river, and it's now become the central point of meeting. You can see this in New York, the new High Line, which has become the most popular thing in the city, a railway on the top where you glide through the city, and where the mayor made the city so much more walkable, and so on. And you may be saying to yourself, why are you telling me this? We've already got this. And I agree, you have already got this, which is why I'm building up to an argument of the incredible potential of Lisbon. So perhaps we should really be talking about 3.0, because in fact, this thing that I'm talking about now, place and space and atmosphere and so on, if you look at the older model of thinking through how economies worked, it was very much one idea, one production, one distributor going to households. But now it's much more to do with small entities connecting, creating alliances, creating then also interesting supply chains and distribution mechanisms, virtual, physical, and so on, leading to the consumer. So just visually, at a graphic level, you can see and we can feel the changing nature of the economy. And part of that, of course, relates to the here-there phenomenon, where we are here in space, but there somewhere else simultaneously. And that creates a level of instability, the sort of notion of the pop-up culture, where everything seems to melt into air, where even here, this is a cultural institution in London, which has a pop-up restaurant inserted in it, which is very exciting, but at the same time, there's often that sense of anchoring. So here's a German invention, which is an office that you can move around. And these offices and places, which all reflect the nomadic world we live in, of course, are incredibly strong within the creative economy sector. The notion of open source, which of course has affected other industries, very much was, I would say, more taken up within the creative economy sector first than others. And this requires an environment, of course, which is back to that point about openness. Openness in every sense, to cultures and so on, to mixing cultures, like here, Japanese and Chinese art mixed together in one. And here, Amsterdam has a one-stop shop, which is an expat center, which somehow, I'm not saying it's perfect, but at least it exists, makes it easier for foreigners to come in and find their way through. So what we've talked about is rethinking resources, rethinking planning, redesigning city making, and particularly getting beyond the silo. None of this works with rigid departmentalism. None of this can work if that's the case. So that is one of the main organizational requirements. If this new urban story, let's say, of a Lisbon is to be told, it will only work with the sort of things you said about collaboration earlier in your talk. Because a lot of this is very fragile. It's not easy to manage because we're moving from a situation from planning the known in a predict and provide model to planning for the unknown, in a sense, by ensuring one can remain resilient. And this is the spirit of the times we live in, I believe, for good and for bad. And every city, this is the Shanghai Expo, is asking itself this question: how can I, when this is happening, blend nature, the city, new forms of living together, suburbs and centers, and how can I create some new, more, better ideal of a new urbanity? And I think one of the solutions may be, I'm not sure which, is the sort of platform you are beginning to develop, your creativity platform, which I think in time will widen. But it requires that sense of different parties coming together that come from different areas, that are willing to give and bring to the joint conversation. And if you summarize all that together, and I'm near the end, you'll be pleased to know, if you take everything together and say, what are the 5 points of a great city that is both creative and livable, Liverpool's okay, it would be a place of anchorage where tradition and stability in the past are there, as well as a place of possibility, which is the opposite in some sense, a place that connects internally and externally, a place that allows you to self-realize and self-improve and occasionally inspires. And I think those principles are, relatively speaking, cross-cultural and true through time. So certainly having some sense of a past, I think, is wonderful because it's a source, it's a bedrock from which to develop the new. And that new may be like here in the Library of Singapore, a possibility room. Lots of people went in there. I don't know what they did in there, but nevertheless, typically Singapore, we have to name it the possibility room. But then that connection, which of course you've got, I don't know, I've forgotten how many cultures you've got, but bridging those differences between cultures, finding ways of learning and being inspired. Now, we try to, all I've really said is the great city has differences. It's calm and lively at the same time. So, unfortunately, much of what I've said is not possible to do because the economic dynamic tends to stop people building the cities they love. Many of the new things that are being built have nothing to do with the sort of dialogue, and not dialogue, I'm giving you a monologue, I'm sorry. I hope we have a dialogue in a minute. But it does require a degree of courage and willingness to bend the market. Now, we've tried to work out a method of just some points, and I'll just highlight finally these points, of measuring the pulse of a city in terms of its creativity. And there are 10 areas, and I'm just going to mention them. The first is the political public framework, its regulations and regime and incentives regime, open and flexible and positive about this? Secondly, what's the degree to which the distinctiveness and vitality can come out? Thirdly, the city more open than closed in terms of its character? Fourthly, is entrepreneurship, private, public, social entrepreneurship, etc., allowed to come across? Is the city strategically agile? Does it know where it's going, but is willing to be strategically principled and tactically flexible? Is the learning landscape, and I saw those figures you showed earlier, how broad is it? But more importantly, are these people talking to each other? Is there communication within the city itself? How is the place being made? We know it's fantastic, as it is, but what's the new stuff like? Is it just as good as some of the stuff we admire from the old? How livable is it in terms of facilities and resources? And perhaps most importantly, do people here walk the talk? It's one thing talking about creativity, there's another thing doing something about it. And here, my final point is I think the biggest asset of European cities is their urbanity. And urbanity, of course, is a classic idea. You know, Italian medieval cities began that whole notion. Can the city region, and when we talk about creativity, it has to be the city region, be a model of that? And here I think the creative economy can help in each sector. Urbanity is, of course, the right to the city and responsibility for it. So it's a twofold process. So a shared commons, that is a major area where the creative economy helps. It's beyond the self. It does all these things. It helps libraries work and so on. Secondly, this cultural literacy point, which I've talked about a bit, where difference comes together. A Catholic woman talking to an imam. She's got the Quran, he's got the Bible. Eco-consciousness. I mean, there's so many things from within creative economy knowledge that can help the city become green. Healthy urban planning, planning that makes you healthy rather than you having to go to the gym. I saw this American city which said we're a walkable city. What they actually meant was walking on these machines because the city is not walkable. Fifthly, the aesthetic responsibility, because in the end, I haven't used the word ugliness and beauty a lot, but a lot of this is about discussions on ugliness and beauty. And this building is Helsinki's building. Alvar Aalto built it. It was voted the worst building in Helsinki and the best. Fantastic, because then we can have a debate about what is good and bad. And I've already said creative city making. So, do you want the Dubai model or the Lisbon model? And lastly, an invigorated democracy. So that means for me the city is really like a work of art. Plato said that, but I would put living in. Thank you very much.
Well, let's start the conversations now. I invite Antonio Câmara, and everybody knows Antonio Câmara from CEO of White Dreams, and Antonio itself embodied some of this mixture, these cross things, and this a different way of looking at things and create things. So, Antonio Câmara, please.
Okay, well, first of all, thanks for the invitation, and you know, when I have this duty of summarizing talks, I always remember a story from Woody Allen. Woody Allen started in stand-up comedy in New York City, and at the time he was making fun of the speed reading courses that were very famous in the US. I mean, he was saying that one day he had a final exam in his speed reading course, and the assignment was to read War and Peace from Leon Tolstoy in 20 minutes. And the answer was, it deals with Russia. So I can summarize the talk from Charles Landry. It deals with creative cities, and I could go out. But basically, I think the major discussion started with this debate between if we want a creative economy or we want creativity in the economy, and basically that the city is the perfect environment for the latter as well as the former. And basically we can bring creativity in a city through interventions that can be either physical or can be intangible. It can be hardware, much like in the past, but also in developing a new kind of software where you start with curiosity all the way of bringing innovation forward. And you can work in sectors, but also in some sort of a crossover interaction between sectors. And I really think that the first stopping point for me was the debate of some sort of the exclusion that the rise of the creative class implies versus the inclusion that we want everyone, even ordinary people, to do extraordinary things in a creative city. And for that, you know, I remember a talk close to here in the Portugal Pavilion by William Wynne, which was a historical mayor in Austin. And he said, you know, and someone asked, what is the key of the Austin success? And he said, well, the key of Austin's success is to keep talent, and the top talent we have. And the answer is very simple: fun. You know, so I really think that fun is a key element of bringing creativity in a city and attracting the top talent. But I really think that right now there is a new story, and I think Charles Landry mentioned it. It's that the entry barriers to develop extraordinary things is getting lower and lower. Right now, anyone with an idea through the new fabrication methods can build prototypes, and with prototypes it can go to crowdfunding worldwide. And now the idea of developing products is becoming even more important than developing companies. So almost anyone can do extraordinary things, and I think this is not a result only of a creative city, but of a creative world we are living in. Then I think there is an important debate about Lisbon, where we live, and we are debating. And I think much of the interventions of the past were in that direction of creating icons. And I think it's interesting to debate if well, right now we don't have money to build new icons, but I really think that the debate is icons versus people. And as I said, because the entry barriers are much lower, we can really encourage people to develop extraordinary things. Funding is always missing, and it's a scarce resource, but there's a big difference between developing new companies like in the past, of developing products like today. Also, Charles Landry mentioned that this is not a debate, it's an imperative. It's a matter of survival. We have to have creative cities, and we have to have a Lisbon that is a creative city. And in this creative sort of movement, I think there are two sort of extremes. All of us want to live in a village, but at the same time, to be successful, we have to be in a frontier. And I really think that a key element that is totally missing not only in the Lisbon, but also in the Portugal debate, it's what is the frontier we want to be in? I mean, I really think there are many frontiers in many areas. There are lots of people in Portugal that live in those frontiers, but I think that is a key element of policy. And I can give some examples. Of course, there is one that we are debating all the time. The ocean or the sea is a frontier. And then we debate and debate and debate, and it's not and it is very little that is practical about it. I'm an engineer, by the way. So
we love engineers.
Yeah, and then there is another, and there are many other debates, you know, from a technological standpoint. I really think right now, and 2 weeks ago, top executives from Intel visited my company and visited also the municipality. You know, I really think that we are ideally positioned to be in a new frontier, which is to create Internet of Objects. In all the areas that Internet of Objects will deal, from printed electronics to augmented reality, to robotics, to the data handling, we are very, very, very strong. And to finish and to be concise, I really think that Charles Landry's contribution in terms of a creative city index is very, very important, and will enable us to evaluate our progress in Lisbon and elsewhere in our country. And that's it.
Okay, thank you very much, Antonio. Grazie. Do you want to make some comments, and then we go to the public and ask people or invite people to interact with Charles, because he is not here many often. So.
Yeah, maybe good afternoon, everybody. Maybe just 2 minutes, and then we'll pass the words to the audience, because I think we have to finish by 5:10, 10 minutes, maybe. Just two notes on what Charles said and what we have discussed here. Maybe I will start by the last slide of your presentation, which was democracy. You mentioned alongside your presentation the importance of the co-creation and the participatory projects, and how people are present in the life of the city, and that how is that important to the creative environment and to the, how do you call it, the curiosity environment. I think that's really very important. Paulo just mentioned the participatory budget in Lisbon, and I don't cease to mention this because really it was very important for the way Lisbon started in the entrepreneurship environment. The startup that you've seen and that you put the photo there, in fact, was a proposal by the participatory budget, was one of the most voted ones in Lisbon. And it started there. And it started there, if you want, the anchor of many other things than in the last 2 years, maybe because of the curiosity, maybe because of people felt that something was happening. New projects arose and new platforms, exactly, new platforms arose. I'm just going to mention 2 projects. For instance, you talked a lot about transforming old industries and old buildings that were closed, that are closed in the cities, in new co-working spaces or in new area spaces. That is usually important. And we have tried in Lisbon, at least, to mix the public initiative with the private initiative and trying to bring the citizens and the people that are in these platforms to the first role, if you want, of this. We have Startup is a public project with private partners, but a public-private project. But I think Paul mentioned also the Central Station, which is a good example that was opened 3 weeks ago, I think, which was an old building in times was the Central Station that was closed for many years, and that now is occupied by an incubator designed for creative people. It's a private project. We are just supporting the project, but we think that this is the way. And yesterday, we just signed a protocol with also private partners to rehabilitate an old hospital that is closed since 2006 in a very important area of the city, which was degrading, in fact, and where new projects, mainly creative urban areas, will emerge. So I think the key, at least on the way we see it, the key is how can you, in fact, push people to imagine things, to produce things, and to invent projects. And if you can manage to do that, people will respond. And that's what we have been seeing in Lisbon. Most of the things that are happening have some kind of hands of the municipality, of public partners, but in fact are private and very interesting initiatives from people that wants to say that although we are in a crisis, although we are in a very difficult moment, this is the time to risk something, and this is the time to do something. And maybe in Lisbon, as you said before, the fact that we were left behind at a certain point of our history now is a very critical advantage we have. Because we can look at Madrid, we can look at Barcelona, we can look at Milano, and you know what we cannot do. And maybe that's something that we can transform in a very rich way. So maybe I just give it to the audience, Paul, and maybe have a moment of questions.
Yes. Please, you have microphones. This one, over there.
Eu vou falar em português, e se não se importam, depois fazem a tradução. Por isso, eu sou do Chapitão e estou localizada numa zona histórica da cidade de Lisboa e queria dar os parabéns por este livro que eu acabo de apanhar ali fora. Só não percebia se este livro é um projeto da Câmara Municipal ou se é da cidade toda de Lisboa, incluindo as associações que não pertencem, enfim, ao protetorado da Câmara Municipal, mas são património do Estado. Como, por exemplo, o Chapitão está numa prisão, antiga prisão de raparigas, por isso património do Estado. E fiquei um bocado surpreendida porque, como é uma atividade que nós desenvolvemos há tantos anos, incluindo a reinserção social, a cultura, o turismo cultural, a formação, a integração, todo esse tipo de atividades, não vir mencionado neste livro maravilhoso que está aqui à entrada. Eu não percebi se era realmente uma coisa só da Câmara ou se era realmente de todo o património português, cultural. E fiquei assim um bocadinho surpreendida a dizer o que é que será, ou se esqueceram, ou se não sabem, ou o que é que foi. De qualquer modo, como é um livro tão bonito e está ali assim para toda a gente, Eu gostaria de ter estado também presente. Era só um bocadinho esta ideia enfim, de património da Câmara Municipal ou de toda a cidade, como cidadã. Só isso, obrigada, não sabia.
Graça, podemos responder a esta?
Eu posso, talvez o Paulo pode responder. Não sei se calhar não estava cá no início quando o Paulo apresentou como é que foi construído o blueprint, mas de qualquer maneira não é património nem da Câmara nem do Estado, é património das pessoas e da cidade, foi aliás uma das coisas que nós dissemos. E naturalmente, como o Paulo também disse, isto é o início de algo. Há muitas instituições para além do chapitão que para nós é irrelevante se é do Estado, se é da Câmara, se é privado, o que interessa é que é uma instituição relevante da cidade e que tem um contributo muito importante naquilo que nós consideramos as áreas culturais e criativas. E, portanto, aí não estarão também muitas outras instituições e associações relevantes da cidade, porque o objetivo não era esse, o objetivo não era fazer um mapeamento de todas as instituições, o objetivo é dizer Lisboa é isto, Lisboa tem muitos atores, aí não estão, aliás, alguns dos mapas que o Paulo aqui apresentou, precisamente com algumas de outros atores que aí estão. Deixe-me só... Depois podemos falar a seguir, se quiser, mas já agora para tentar também que outras pessoas possam intervir. Aí não vão estar todas as associações, aí está o mapa de tudo o que existe na cidade e como o Paulo começou por apresentar, esse blueprint é um convite à ação, ou seja, é o nosso ponto de partida, a partir do qual registro desde já que poderemos contar com o chapitão para construir o que vem a seguir e os passos que vêm a seguir.
Deixa-me só para complementar, porque se calhar não tenho conhecimento, só para informar, eu não tenho o número exato. Nós, quando fizemos basicamente 2 trabalhos neste pequeno blueprint, que são, um é quantificação, estatísticas oficiais, e o segundo, que é o mapeamento. E o chapitão está no mapeamento. Ou seja, nós fizemos uma súmula neste documento e nós temos, eu não sei o número de cor, mas entre 200 a 300 instituições que estão no mapeamento, em todos os segmentos das indústrias criativas, e se me puderem corrigir, o chapitão está no mapeamento do documento. E vai estar, e nós queremos que o chapitão é uma instituição interessantíssima, importantíssima na cidade de Lisboa, como as outras 200 que trabalham em segmentos muito diferentes. E está no mapeamento e nós queremos que faça parte do futuro da economia criativa da cidade de Lisboa, como faz hoje. E, portanto, a única informação
aqui o Castelo São Jorge não estar aqui mencionado.
Yes.
O Castelo, eu estou a falar o chapitão porque estamos do Castelo.
Muito bem.
O Castelo.
Boa tarde. Eu vou dirigir-me em inglês porque gostaria de fazer a questão.
Se puder levantar, desculpa, nós daqui temos alguma dificuldade. Obrigada.
Boa tarde. I'm going to talk in English because I would like to direct my question to Mr. Charles. Well, first of all, thank you. It was a very good explanation of what exactly are the creative industries. I'm a product designer and I'm currently working as a designer maker. And I've been struggling to find like a place, well, my place in this big tank of the creative industries, because I'm focusing not in a high-tech or high-end or global area. I'm focusing on something that's more like a craft. And one of the things that when I was starting this project, I thought about Startup Lisbon, and then I saw that there was a barrier just right at the beginning because it was focused only on technological companies or startups that were focused on technology. And my question, because I saw you had like an approach to the crafts world as well in your presentation as being an important part of the creative industry sector. My question is, do you think that it's like an area where people should work in still and like focus and use some energy, spend energy on it, or for being...
Can you repeat the sectors that you mentioned?
The craft. Yeah, like manufacturing, because we have like, I don't know if you know, but we have like a large tradition of like great manufacturing processes in Portugal. And my focus was exactly not to let these old people die because they're dying, and nobody's actually, because we all wanted to be doctors and architects at some point, and like nobody really cared to learn about the old processes. And I think that should be very valuable in the future because they're going to disappear. So my question was, is that in like a global world, do you think that's something that people should focus on? Or is it really the future is all about like technology and globalization? And what's your opinion about the crafts and like smaller production areas? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I personally think there will always be a space for crafted goods. I think the globalization process may, at one level, be positive because, in principle, through various forms of new media, you may or may not be able to, communicate your work and products to a wider world. Clearly, if you're into, batch production or as distinct from mass production either of applications or whatever else, clearly you have a different industrial dynamic, but it's often precisely in the craft area, or the best of craft often is the thing that is then acts as the prototype for someone else to take up later in a more mass-produced thing. So I would say it's really part of the palette of what we're describing. That's my view, anyway.
I have a question for Mr. Charles Landry. Of course, this is the rise of the people and their ideas. Like some other times in history, we had something like that. Right now there's a series going on television about the Da Vinci and how the Medicis helped their city funding arts and creativity in a way, and how the Pope always tending to dominate Florence. So there's a question. Because we are assisting to a change of a paradigm from the kind of absolutistic way of ruling countries and people and societies to a more people-driven society. The question is how this kind of traditional and conservative organisms will react to this kind of people in that rise. Of course, people nowadays have more tools and weapons to communicate their words and their deeds, so it's easier in a way. So will this hurt for our society? So this is the...
Yeah, thanks. There's an incredible echo, so I hope I've understood what you're saying. Thank God your ears are bad as mine, because you sort of, ooh. But basically what I think you were saying was about, we're in a shift, a major shift, which is more into being people-focused. The organizational structures that surround us are more, let's say, top-down. I think that this is a major issue going on, and we are in the middle of this battle. And I think the sort of examples you just gave a moment ago, for example, how the startup LISBOA and all of that started, is an example of a shift into a more facilitating type of, what do we call it, approach, or whatever we want to call it. But anyway, it's different from you just saying, here you are, take it, and I put my manager in, and so on. But I do think there's a more, so even though, let's say, Grata has done that type of thing, or the municipality has done that sort of thing, there is the heritage of very hierarchical structures. And I did a project in Bilbao, the region of Bilbao, around the innovation sector and the same sector you lead, and the administration. And they basically said, we live in a world of schizophrenia. The world out there is operating more in the ways you know, which is much more connected and whatever, grassrootsy. But we are here supposed to help these people as an authority, but we are constrained by the administration law of Spain and lots of other things. And this is, I think, the major battle. That's why my latest obsession is called The Creative Bureaucracy. So I'm collecting examples from all over the world. I can see where bureaucracies are reinventing themselves. And I'm using the word bureaucracy on purpose because I like the tension between bureaucracy, which sounds boring, dull, grey, and creativity, which sounds exciting. And that tension is very interesting to me because we need administration. We need things to be, in some sense, to be governed and all of that, but in a different way. And a lot of what we're talking about in this new economy is, a lot of it is based on trust and transparency. And I'm not saying I know the answer, but this is a major, I don't want to call it battlefield, let's call it a field of discussion and co-creation, since you mentioned co-creation, jointly working out how one jointly makes policies, as you just talked about in terms of the participatory budget, as one example.
Oh, sorry, and then here.
Thank you, Charles, for your excellent, inspiring presentation. As always, inspiring. I'd like to ask you a question. Sorry, I didn't say my name. It's Michael da Costa. I'm kind of into the creative industries, as people probably know. I'd like to ask you a question about failure. I think Bill Gates said that success is a lousy teacher. And I think while you're here and after your extensive travel, I think it might be interesting for you to share with us maybe some of the potential pitfalls or the potential mistakes that Lisbon could make as it pushes towards the creative city network, or being part of that ecosystem, or surpassing that ecosystem, which I think it has the potential to do. Thank you.
Yes, the question was about failure and so on. I mentioned indirectly one or two of them, which is to do with priority setting. I think one of the, I mean, I know we're in a period where we have less money, but the classic potential failure was putting more in containers and less in content. So you build a container. I don't want to mention certain countries where you've got all these empty containers and no content because there's no budget left. That perhaps won't happen here because there's not money for that, but that's one of the biggest reasons why some of the creative initiatives haven't happened. The second one is, again, relates to the question we just raised earlier, which is really the need to do top-down, bottom-up simultaneously, finding a way of doing that. So sometimes cities have wonderful intentions and the policy reads, when I say correct, you know what I mean? The policy all reads very well, but the internal institutional mechanisms aren't capable of delivering them, even though the intent is good. The third area of failure, and again, I think you're addressing many of them, is well, it's not a failure, but the big issue is really linking, if we're talking about this discussion, the cultural department and the economic department and the urban planning department together in a very relaxed way, developing a common language about joint aims and goals and so on. And that's easier said than done. Once that type of thing happens, both internally and externally, one begins to feel that 1 + 1 can make 3. And I find it astonishing the way when you sometimes have the opportunity, which perhaps many of you have had, to look at a situation, a city, sort of from a bird's view, you often see that many of the solutions are already there, but they're in different boxes. And because the boxes don't talk to each other, resources are wasted because they're always only dealing with a part of the problem. So really this integrated approach is, looking at it more from a public sector perspective, perhaps the major danger if that doesn't happen.
We are closing. One more question. Deputy Mayor of Culture of Lisbon City Council. It's the next person to speak.
Great.
So,
are you Mrs. Culture?
Yeah.
Hello.
Hello. I just wanted to present myself. The person for culture. I'm Catarina Vaz Pinto. I'm in fact a cultural agent before being a politician, having a policy task. I just want to congratulate you and to say that I've been thinking these questions for quite a long time, And first I was very, in the beginning when I was started to heard about this creative economy and things like that, I looked around me in Portugal and I think, what is this in Portugal? There is nothing in Portugal because in the cultural sector, because people doesn't, this is a very much Anglo-Saxon approach to ways of thinking. And in the beginning, I think it mainly politicians took this rhetoric very easily, not understanding how the whole system works and how the complexity, how complex is the system, and how it in one of your slides you said the creation and this, production distribution is much more made of small producers, single persons, than bigger issues, and this is the reality of the cultural sector, and you need very much to understand, I think, the complexity and of what is making a film, and when you are making a film, the difference between making a documentary or a feature film, or when you are working with performing arts or visual arts or pop music or classical music, everything has its own system of, has its own economy, but of course they can be all linked. And for us politicians to bring them all together, we also have to have this straight look and then see the overall picture, the global picture. And this is, I think, is the most, it's not easy to do it. And also, it's difficult to put, most of our my generation and most generation, we were trained to look into boxes. So this shift of thinking and of attitudes, it's something that we have to work a lot, and mainly in our public institutions. But we are going to do, we do that, we are trying to do that, and I think it's a major question to deal with, and to, I think also the other danger is we have to be very to trust in our own identity, and not wanting to copy the other creative cities. So to find where is our creativity, where are our creative assets, and this is and this needs self trust in ourselves, and sometimes it's not so easy also. But congratulations, and I hope to see you again.
Just a very brief response to that. I mean, I once did a series of piece of research interviewing people about who they most admired in cities and what their qualities were. And there were two qualities that came out, the people who were most effective and admired. And they were people who knew a subject very well, i.e. could think vertically, but knew the essence of other subjects, i.e. could think horizontally. So that was one characteristic. The other characteristic, when I explored it more in detail, is that the people that were most admired had had an interesting training. For example, studying French and urban planning. But anyway, sort of things that came from different directions, which fed that mind that could do this and this simultaneously. Anyway, I just give you that, but that was the result of that piece of work.
Okay. We don't have more time, so we must close. And I would like to invite Graça Fonseca to make the closing remarks if you want.
Thank you. Just to thank Charles and thank Tony. I don't know, you want to say anything?
No.
Can I thank
Any
you?
final comment?
Can I thank you?
Yeah, you can thank all of us.
Can I thank you?
It was, thank you very much for this. I think now we'll have another forum at 5:30, right? So we have about 50 minutes to take coffee and pastel nata, I hope. And I've been trying to have pastel nata besides other cookies here. And I think the main challenge for us at Lisbon, and maybe we can discuss with Charles and with other persons in the future, is really how can we make, there's a very interesting point you made there, that nowadays 64% of the people choose the city and then the job. So what we need to do is to put Lisbon in the mind of those 64% of the people, and then here have the conditions that they can choose a job, or at least, as we talked in lunch, stay here for a while, start here something, and who knows, go elsewhere, but who knows, return to Lisbon and start something here. So I think this is our main challenge for Lisbon, is how to put our city in the mind of at least 60% of the people that globally choose a city before a job. So thank you very much, and have a nice evening.
Just a small comment.
Retomaremos os trabalhos após uma breve pausa com o quinto e último platô sobre arte, tecnologia e o futuro de Portugal.